The metallic click of the AR-15 being cocked echoed through Union Station's underground platform, like a gunshot in a cathedral. Commuters froze mid-step, coffee cups suspended halfway to lips, newspapers rustling to stillness as 200 pairs of eyes fixed on the surreal tableau unfolding before them. Officer Janet Kozlowski, badge number 4471, gleaming on her tactical vest, aimed the barrel directly at the chest of a tall black man in an impeccable charcoal suit who stood calmly beside the yellow safety line, his leather briefcase at his feet like an offering. Down on the ground, now her partner, Officer Rebecca Martinez, badge 4FUSHI72, brandished her service weapon with trembling hands, her voice cracking with an authority she didn't possess. Face down, hands behind your head. The suited man didn't move. He studied them with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their uniforms, their positioning, their obvious inexperience. His breathing remained steady while chaos erupted around him. A woman with a stroller backed against the tiled wall, her baby beginning to wail. An elderly man dropped his walking cane, the metallic clatter adding to the symphony of fear that permeated the underground air. "I said get down." Kozlowski's voice rose an octave, the AR-15 wavering slightly in her grip. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air that circulated through the station's ventilation system. Anthony Greer, governor-elect of the state of Pennsylvania, remained standing. He had awakened at 4:30 that morning in his modest Philadelphia apartment, the same one-bedroom unit he had refused to leave despite his recent electoral victory. The transition team had insisted on upgrading his security detail, but Greer had wanted one final morning of anonymity, one last ride on public transportation before the protective bubble of elected office enclosed him forever. He had chosen his clothing carefully, the charcoal Armani suit that had been his lucky charm throughout the campaign, the burgundy tie his late mother had given him for his law school graduation, the Italian leather shoes that still bore the scuff marks from walking precincts in North Philadelphia. The irony wasn't lost on him that his final moment of freedom had brought him face to face with exactly the kind of systematic oppression he had spent his entire political career fighting to dismantle. "Sir, please comply with the officer's instructions," called out Marcus Thompson, a maintenance worker who had been mopping the platform when the confrontation began. His voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed too many such encounters, who understood the precarious mathematics of survival in situations where badge and gun trumped reason and justice. Greer finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to addressing hostile audiences. "Officers, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. May I ask what crime you suspect me of committing?" "You match the description of a suspect in an armed robbery that occurred 20 minutes ago at the First National Bank on Market Street," Martinez replied, though her hands continued to shake as she maintained her firing stance. "Black male, 6 feet tall, business attire, carrying a briefcase." The description was so generic, it could have applied to dozens of men on the platform that morning. But Greer recognized the familiar pattern. He had studied enough cases, reviewed enough statistics, heard enough stories from constituents who looked like him to understand that specificity was never the point. The point was fear, control, and the centuries-old presumption that black skin equaled criminality until proven otherwise. "I understand your concern, officers, but I assure you, I haven't robbed any banks this morning." Greer's attempt at levity fell flat in the tense atmosphere. Several commuters had begun recording with their phones, the digital eyes of social media capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. Kozlowski noticed the phones and her already elevated stress level spiked dangerously higher. "Everyone put your phones away. This is an active police situation." She swung the AR-15 toward the crowd, causing screams and a panicked shuffle toward the exits. The platform is now under lockdown. The word lockdown sent a chill through the morning commuters that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. These were people with jobs to reach, families to support, lives that didn't accommodate unexpected delays caused by overzealous security personnel. But they also understood that arguing with armed officers rarely ended well for anyone, especially when those officers appeared to be operating under extreme stress. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, had been reviewing patient charts on her tablet when the commotion began. She looked up to see a scene that reminded her of the news footage she had watched with growing horror over the past few years. "Excuse me, officers," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. "I'm a physician. Is anyone injured? Do you need medical assistance?" "Ma'am, step back and remain quiet," Martinez shouted, her weapon now trained on Dr. Chen. "This doesn't concern you." But it did concern her, just as it concerned every person on that platform who understood that injustice anywhere was a threat to justice everywhere. Dr. Chen continued recording despite the officer's demands, her hands steady from years of surgical training, her heart racing from the adrenaline of witnessing history unfold in real time. Greer slowly raised his hands, palms open, fingers spread wide. "Officers, I'm going to reach into my jacket pocket very slowly to retrieve my identification. Is that acceptable?" "Don't move!" Kozlowski screamed, the AR-15 now aimed directly at Greer's head. "Any sudden movements, and we will fire." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Everyone on the platform understood that they were witnessing a moment that could end in tragedy, that the thin line between law enforcement and lawlessness was being crossed by officers who seemed more concerned with asserting dominance than maintaining peace. Reverend Michael Washington, pastor of Mount Olive Baptist Church, had been returning from an early morning prayer breakfast when he found himself trapped in the unfolding drama. He had counseled too many families who had lost loved ones in similar situations, had delivered too many eulogies for young black men whose only crime was existing in spaces where their presence was deemed threatening. "Lord, please don't let this be another tragedy," he whispered, his voice carrying just loud enough for those around him to hear. The prayer seemed to have an effect on the crowd, as several people began to quietly echo his words. The platform filled with a low murmur of supplications, a collective plea for reason to prevail over fear, for humanity to triumph over hatred. Greer remained perfectly still, his experience as a former prosecutor having taught him the delicate choreography required to survive encounters with law enforcement. He had prosecuted enough cases of police misconduct to understand that any movement, any perceived threat, could be used to justify the use of deadly force. The irony that he would soon be in a position to reform the very system that was now threatening his life was not lost on him. "Officers, my name is Anthony Greer. I'm an attorney, and I believe this situation is based on a case of mistaken identity." His voice remained calm, professional, the same tone he had used when addressing juries who held the fates of his clients in their hands. "Sure you are," Kozlowski sneered, her finger moving dangerously close to the trigger. "And I'm the Queen of England. Face down on the ground, now, or we will make you comply." The platform's fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the scene like specters of injustices past. The smell of diesel fuel from the trains mixed with the acrid scent of fear-induced sweat, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and foreboding. Maria Santos, a social worker who had spent her career advocating for marginalized communities, stepped forward despite the obvious danger. "Officers, I'm a licensed social worker. I've been trained in de-escalation techniques. May I suggest we all take a deep breath and try to resolve this situation peacefully. Lady, I'm going to give you 3 seconds to back off before I arrest you for interfering with a police investigation. Martinez's voice had risen to a near shriek, her lack of training evident in her inability to maintain control of the situation or her own emotions. The 3 seconds ticked by like hours. Santos held her ground, her presence serving as a bridge between the armed officers and the innocent commuters who had become unwilling participants in a drama that seemed scripted by centuries of racial prejudice and institutional bias. Greer slowly began to lower himself toward the ground, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As his knees touched the grimy platform tiles, he felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Here he was, weeks away from taking the oath of office as the state's first black governor in over a century, being forced to prostrate himself before officers who saw only his skin color and made assumptions about his character based on nothing more than melanin and morning commute timing. Hands behind your head, interlace your fingers, Kozlowski commanded, approaching with zip-tie restraints that she produced from her tactical vest. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt you'll use it. The Miranda rights were delivered with contempt rather than professional obligation, each word dripping with the kind of disdain that had become endemic in policing communities where officers were trained to view citizens as potential threats rather than people deserving protection and service. As the plastic restraints tightened around his wrists, Greer felt the circulation being cut off to his hands. The zip ties were applied with unnecessary force, a deliberate infliction of discomfort designed to humiliate and dehumanize. He had seen this pattern in countless case files, had interviewed enough victims to recognize the subtle sadism that often accompanied arrests of black suspects. "You're hurting him," called out Jennifer Park, a nurse practitioner who worked at a community health clinic. "Those restraints are too tight. He could lose circulation." "Mind your own business," Martinez snapped. But she glanced nervously at the growing number of phones recording the scene. She whispered something to Kozlowski, who nodded and loosened the restraint slightly, though not enough to restore proper blood flow to Greer's hands. The briefcase sat abandoned beside Greer's prone form, like evidence of a life interrupted. Inside were documents that would have immediately identified him, correspondence from the transition team, briefing papers on state budget priorities, letters from constituents congratulating him on his historic victory. But the officers showed no interest in examining evidence that might contradict their preconceived narrative. Instead, Kozlowski pulled out her department-issued smartphone and began live streaming to the HOA's social media channels. "This is Officer Kozlowski, reporting a successful apprehension of a suspected bank robber at Union Station. The perpetrator matched the description perfectly and is now in custody." The livestream began accumulating viewers immediately, the HOA's followers eager to witness what they perceived as justice being served. Comments began flooding the feed, most of them celebrating the officer's quick action, though a few expressed concern about the heavy-handed tactics being employed. Greer lifted his head slightly from the cold concrete. "Officers, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to examine my identification before this situation escalates beyond anyone's ability to control it." His words carried an authority that seemed incongruous with his position face down on the platform. But several commuters noticed the subtle shift in his tone. This wasn't the voice of a criminal pleading for mercy. This was the voice of someone who wielded power, who understood systems and consequences, who was offering a final chance for reason to prevail. "The only thing escalating here is your attitude, pal," Kozlowski replied, though something in Greer's demeanor gave her pause. She had made hundreds of arrests during her 5-year career, but none of the suspects had ever spoken with such measured confidence while restrained and prone on the ground. Dr. Robert Kim, a constitutional law professor at Temple University, had been grading papers on his morning commute when the confrontation began. He recognized the legal implications of what he was witnessing and began making detailed notes on his phone. "Officers, I'm documenting potential civil rights violations for legal review. Are you prepared to justify the use of force in this situation?" "Are you threatening us?" Martinez demanded, her weapon still drawn despite the fact that the supposed suspect was now restrained and prone. "I'm informing you of the legal ramifications of your actions." "Dr. Kim replied calmly. "This incident is being recorded by multiple witnesses and will likely be subject to internal affairs review, regardless of the outcome." The mention of internal affairs caused both officers to exchange nervous glances. They were relatively new to the force, having been hired as part of the HOA's expansion into transit security, and neither had received adequate training in de-escalation techniques or constitutional law. Their supervisors had emphasized the importance of appearing tough and decisive, but had provided little guidance on how to handle complex situations that required nuance and judgment. Thomas Rodriguez, a veteran of the Iraq War who worked as a security consultant, had been observing the officers' tactics with growing alarm. Their positioning was poor, their communications were unprofessional, and their escalation of force seemed disproportionate to the alleged threat. "Officers, as someone with military police training, I'd like to suggest some tactical adjustments that might improve the safety of everyone involved." "We don't need suggestions from civilians," Kozlowski snapped, but her defensive response revealed her insecurity about her own competence in the situation. The crowd of commuters had swelled as word of the confrontation spread through the station. People emerged from coffee shops and newsstands to witness the spectacle, their phones creating a digital constellation of recording devices that captured every moment from multiple angles. The HOA's livestream was being shared across social media platforms, generating thousands of views and hundreds of comments that ranged from supportive to deeply critical. Greer's assistant, Patricia Williams, had been tracking his morning schedule from the transition office downtown when he failed to arrive for his 8 o'clock briefing. She began making calls to locate him. Her third call was to the Union Station security office, where she learned about an ongoing incident involving law enforcement on Platform B. "Sir, I need to report a possible emergency involving Governor-elect Anthony Greer," she told the dispatcher at the State Capitol Police Communications Center. "He may be involved in some kind of confrontation at Union Station." The State Capitol Police maintained a protective detail for high-ranking elected officials, though Greer had consistently refused their services during the transition period. His security team had been monitoring his movements remotely through a GPS chip embedded in his official state identification card, but they had assumed he was simply running late for his morning appointments. Back on the platform, Greer remained motionless as the officers continued their investigation. Kozlowski had seized his briefcase and was rifling through its contents, looking for evidence to support their robbery theory. Instead, she found documents that made her increasingly uncomfortable official letterhead from the governor-elect's transition team. Briefing papers marked with the state seal. Correspondence from federal officials congratulating someone named Anthony Greer on his electoral victory. "Martinez, come look at this," she whispered, holding up a letter from the President of the United States, addressed to the Honorable Anthony Greer, Governor-elect, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Martinez examined the document, her face growing pale as the implications began to sink in. "This has to be fake, some kind of elaborate identity theft scheme." But even as she spoke the words, Martinez felt a growing sense of dread. The documents looked authentic, the letterhead was precise, and the quantity of official correspondence suggested either an incredibly sophisticated criminal operation or the possibility that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Father Giuseppe Benedetti, pastor of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, had been returning from a hospital visit when he encountered the scene. He approached slowly, his clerical collar visible, his hands raised peacefully. "Officers, I'm a priest. May I offer pastoral care to anyone who needs it? Sometimes these situations benefit from spiritual guidance." The presence of clergy seemed to have a calming effect on some of the bystanders, though the officers remained tense and defensive. Kozlowski glanced at the growing crowd of witnesses, realizing that their actions were being scrutinized by representatives from multiple community organizations, religious institutions, and professional associations. "Father, unless you have law enforcement training, I need you to step back," she said, though her tone was more respectful than it had been with previous civilian interventions. Greer turned his head slightly to address the priest. "Father, would you please call my office and inform them that I've been detained at Union Station? The number is in my phone, which should be in my jacket pocket." "Nobody's making any phone calls," Martinez interjected. But her authority was beginning to waver as more community leaders gathered around the scene. The platform had transformed into an impromptu town hall meeting, with citizens from all walks of life bearing witness to what many recognized as a pivotal moment in their community's ongoing struggle with police accountability and racial justice. The diverse crowd included teachers, social workers, small business owners, retirees, students, and working parents who understood that the outcome of this confrontation would have implications far beyond the individuals directly involved. Angela Davis, a high school principal who had been commuting to work, stepped forward with the authority that came from managing teenagers and their parents for over 2 decades. "Officers, I'm an educator, and I work with young people every day who need to see that our justice system operates fairly and professionally. What example are you setting for the children who might see this video?" Her question struck at the heart of the broader social implications of the confrontation. In an era when police interactions were regularly captured and shared online, every encounter became a teaching moment that shaped public perception of law enforcement and institutional justice. Kozlowski was beginning to sweat profusely, despite the cool morning air. The livestream had attracted over 10,000 viewers, and the comments were becoming increasingly critical of the officers' handling of the situation. Several viewers had begun identifying inconsistencies in the officer's account, pointing out that the suspect description was too generic to justify the level of force being employed. As she scrolled through the briefcase documents more carefully, Kozlowski found Greer's state identification card, the one with the embedded GPS chip that had been pinging the Capitol Police Communications Center for the past 20 minutes. The photo matched the man on the ground, and the name matched the correspondence from federal and state officials. But it was the small detail that caught her attention and made her blood run cold: the official state signet ring visible on Greer's left hand, the one that had been cutting into his finger as the zip ties restricted circulation. She had seen that ring in news photographs during the election coverage, worn by the historic candidate who had become the state's first black governor-elect in over a century. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her personal smartphone and conducted a Google image search for Anthony Greer, Pennsylvania governor. The results filled her screen with photographs of campaign rallies, victory speeches, and transition meetings. Every image showed the same face that was now pressed against the grimy platform tiles at her feet. "Oh God," she thought, her heart rate spiking as the full magnitude of their mistake became clear. "We just arrested the incoming governor of Pennsylvania on live television." Meanwhile, the Capitol Police Rapid Response Team had been mobilized and was racing toward Union Station in unmarked vehicles. The GPS signal from Greer's identification card had triggered automatic protocols designed to protect high-ranking elected officials from threats both foreign and domestic. What they didn't yet know was that the threat was coming from within their own law enforcement community. Dr. Lisa Thompson, an emergency room physician who had treated countless victims of police violence, knelt down beside Greer despite the officer's protests. "Sir, I'm a doctor. Are you experiencing any pain or difficulty breathing? Those restraints look dangerously tight." "I'm fine, doctor. Thank you for your concern," Greer replied, though his voice carried a slight strain from the uncomfortable position and restricted circulation. "Doctor," Thompson stood and addressed the officers directly. "From a medical perspective, those restraints pose a serious risk of nerve damage and circulation impairment. I'm documenting potential medical malpractice for my incident report." The mention of medical malpractice added another layer of legal liability to a situation that was already spiraling beyond the officers' ability to control. They had been trained to make arrests, not to manage complex legal and medical considerations that arose from their tactics. Martinez's radio crackled to life with a message that made both officers freeze in terror. "All units, be advised that we have a credible report of the governor-elect being detained by law enforcement at Union Station. Repeat, the governor-elect may be involved in an incident at Union Station. State Capitol Police are responding with Priority 1 status." The color drained from Martinez's face as she realized that their morning arrest was about to become a career-ending catastrophe. She looked at Kozlowski, who was still staring at her phone screen showing search results for Pennsylvania's newly elected governor. "Janet," Martinez whispered, using her partner's first name for the first time since they had been assigned together. "I think we need to call for a supervisor." But it was too late for supervisors. The sound of approaching sirens filled the underground station as state capitol police vehicles screeched to a halt at the street-level entrances. Heavily armed tactical officers in full body armor began descending the stairs, their weapons drawn, their faces grim with the understanding that they were responding to a potential threat against one of the most important political figures in the state. The commuters on the platform pressed against the walls as the Capitol Police team established a perimeter around the scene. These were officers with extensive training in protecting high-ranking officials, and their professional demeanor stood in stark contrast to the amateur hour performance that had been unfolding for the past 30 minutes. HOA officers. This is Captain Rodriguez of the State Capitol Police. You will immediately step away from the subject and identify yourselves. The captain's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Kozlowski and Martinez raised their hands, suddenly finding themselves on the wrong end of superior firepower and training. The AR-15 that had seemed so intimidating when pointed at an unarmed commuter now felt pathetically inadequate when faced with tactical officers carrying military-grade weapons and body armor. "Sir, we're HOA officers Kozlowski and Martinez. We were responding to a robbery suspect who matched the description of—" "Save it for internal affairs." Captain Rodriguez cut her off. "Medic, check the subject for injuries. Everyone else, secure the scene and begin documenting evidence." A Capitol Police medic carefully approached Greer, scissors in hand to cut the zip-tie restraints. "Governor-elect, I'm Officer Patterson, trained paramedic. Can you tell me if you're experiencing any pain or medical distress?" "I'm all right, Officer Patterson, though I'll probably need some circulation restored to my hands," Greer replied, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. As the restraints were cut away, Greer slowly pushed himself up from the platform, his expensive suit now bearing stains from the grimy tiles and his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had endured. The crowd of commuters watched in stunned silence as Pennsylvania's governor-elect brushed off his jacket and straightened his tie with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to public appearances. Captain Rodriguez approached with the deference appropriate for addressing a high-ranking elected official. "Governor-elect Greer, I'm Captain Rodriguez. On behalf of the State Capitol Police, I apologize for this incident. Are you willing to provide a statement about what occurred here? Greer looked around the platform at the faces of the commuters who had witnessed his ordeal. Then, at the two HOA officers, who were now being questioned by internal affairs investigators who had arrived with the Capitol Police response team. Captain, I think the statement I'd like to make is to the media and the public. This incident represents exactly the kind of systemic issues I was elected to address. Within minutes, news crews began arriving at Union Station, alerted by the social media coverage and police scanner traffic. The platform was transformed into an impromptu press conference venue, with reporters setting up cameras and microphones while Greer consulted with his security detail about the safest way to address the situation publicly. Patricia Williams, Greer's assistant, arrived with the transition team's communications director and legal counsel. They huddled briefly with the governor-elect, discussing the political and legal implications of the morning's events, while Capitol Police investigators continued their preliminary investigation of the HOA officers' conduct. Ladies and gentlemen of the press and fellow citizens, Greer began, his voice carrying clearly through the underground space without the aid of amplification. This morning I experienced firsthand the kind of racial profiling and excessive force that too many members of our community face on a regular basis. The assembled crowd listened in absolute silence as their newly elected governor described his ordeal with the measured precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. He spoke of the fear he had seen in the commuters' faces, the professionalism displayed by the Capitol Police response team, and the systemic reforms that would be necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. The officers involved in this incident will face appropriate consequences through the legal system, he continued, his eyes moving to where Kozlowski and Martinez stood in handcuffs beside a Capitol Police supervisor. But more importantly, we must address the training, oversight, and accountability measures that allowed this situation to occur in the first place. Dr. Kim, the constitutional law professor, stepped forward during the informal question period that followed Greer's statement. Governor-elect, as someone who witnessed this entire incident, I want to commend your composure and dignity under extraordinary circumstances. What you experienced today was a textbook example of why we need comprehensive police reform. The other witnesses began sharing their observations, creating an impromptu community dialogue about policing, accountability, and the changes needed to ensure equal treatment under the law. Teachers spoke about the example this incident would set for their students. Medical professionals discussed the health risks posed by improper restraint techniques, and community leaders outlined the broader social implications of racial profiling in law enforcement. Reverend Washington offered a closing prayer that seemed to capture the mood of everyone present. Lord, let this day be remembered not for the injustice that was attempted, but for the justice that will follow. Let it be a turning point toward the beloved community where all people are treated with dignity and respect. As the formal investigation continued over the following weeks, it became clear that Officers Kozlowski and Martinez had violated numerous departmental policies and state laws in their handling of the incident. They were charged with armed assault, false imprisonment, civil rights violations, and official misconduct. The HOA's leadership attempted to distance themselves from the officers' actions, but internal documents revealed a pattern of inadequate training and poor supervision that had contributed to the incident. The livestream video, viewed over 2 million times in the first week after the incident, became a catalyst for legislative reform. Governor-elect Greer used his inaugural address to announce the creation of a comprehensive police accountability task force, with funding for improved training, civilian oversight, and community engagement programs. Dr. Chen, the pediatric surgeon who had recorded the incident, became a key witness in the criminal proceedings against the officers. Her clear video documentation helped prosecutors demonstrate the excessive nature of the force used and the racial bias that had motivated the officers' actions. The commuters who had witnessed the incident formed an informal support network, staying in touch through social media and organizing community meetings to discuss police reform and racial justice issues. Their diverse perspectives and professional backgrounds brought credibility to the reform movement that transcended traditional political divisions. Thomas Rodriguez, the veteran security consultant, was hired by the state to review and revise training protocols for law enforcement agencies throughout Pennsylvania. His military experience and first-hand observation of the incident provided valuable insights into the tactical and procedural failures that had occurred. 6 months after the incident, Governor Greer signed into law the most comprehensive police accountability legislation in the state's history. The law required enhanced training in de-escalation techniques, established civilian review boards with investigative authority, and created strict penalties for officers who engaged in racial profiling or excessive force. Officers Kozlowski and Martinez were convicted on all charges and sentenced to significant prison terms. Their badges and weapons were permanently confiscated, and they were barred from ever working in law enforcement again. The HOA was forced to pay substantial damages to Governor Greer, who donated the entire settlement to organizations working on police reform and racial justice issues. The Union Station platform where the incident occurred was eventually dedicated as a memorial to the ongoing struggle for equal justice under law. A plaque installed near the spot where Governor Greer had been forced to lie face down on the grimy tiles reads, "In memory of all who have suffered injustice, and in hope of a future where every person is treated with dignity and respect." The transformation that began with that confrontation on a subway platform rippled outward through Pennsylvania's communities, inspiring similar reforms in other states and contributing to a national conversation about the relationship between law enforcement and the citizens they are sworn to serve and protect. What had begun as an act of prejudice and abuse of power had ultimately become a catalyst for positive change that would benefit generations of Americans yet to come. Governor Greer served 2 successful terms in office, with police reform remaining a cornerstone of his administration's legacy. The Commuter Safety Task Force he established, funded by the HOA settlement money, became a model for community-oriented policing programs throughout the nation. And every morning when he rode public transportation to the Capitol, as he continued to do throughout his tenure as governor, he was reminded that the true measure of a society's progress is how it treats its most vulnerable members when they encounter the full power of the state. The platform incident, as it came to be known in the history books, represented more than just a case of mistaken identity or police misconduct. It became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and equal treatment under law, a reminder that progress requires constant vigilance, and proof that even in the darkest moments of injustice, the seeds of positive change can take root and flourish. In the end, the 2 officers who had sought to humiliate and dehumanize an innocent man had inadvertently created the conditions for transformative reform that would protect countless others from experiencing similar treatment. Their abuse of power had become the catalyst for accountability. Their prejudice had sparked dialogue about justice, and their attempt to silence witnesses had instead amplified voices calling for change. The morning commuters who had reluctantly become witnesses to history returned to their daily routines, but they carried with them the knowledge that ordinary citizens have the power to demand justice and hold their institutions accountable. They had seen democracy work, even in its most challenging moments, and they understood that their continued engagement would be essential to maintaining the progress that had been achieved. As the years passed, the Union Station platform returned to its normal function as a transit hub for working people going about their daily lives. But those who had been present on that extraordinary morning never forgot the lesson they had learned that injustice anywhere truly is a threat to justice everywhere, and that the courage to bear witness and speak truth to power can transform individual acts of prejudice into collective movements for positive change. The story of what happened on Platform B at Union Station became required reading in police academies, law schools, and civics classes throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. It stood as a testament to the resilience of democratic institutions, the power of citizen engagement, and the possibility of redemption even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that moments of crisis can become opportunities for growth, that individual acts of courage can inspire collective action, and that the arc of justice, while long, truly does bend toward righteousness when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice.